The left has been successful in subverting a sizable amount of institutions, and in some countries, even the majority of them. This has been possible because of two reasons. One, the non-left did absolutely nothing to stop this, and two, the left was patient and followed a very simple but relentless script. And both of these are reversible. We need to learn how to do things to turn this around, and we need patience. And we need a script of our own. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative and another video on the recurring theme here, practical politics. So as usual, all I'm about to say is the result of my own experience and things observed during the last 2 decades or so. As a result, I do not claim to have the absolute truth on the matter and am of course open to new ideas. With that said, my experience ought to be a good starting point for the creation of a script of our own. And throughout this video, I will continuously assume that one wants to subvert and understands the value and the importance of subversion work. And one more thing before we start, this is a video for the common man, practical politics for individuals who do not wield vast resources and vast numbers of people. Basically, liberty as a lifestyle choice. So with that, let us begin. For the purposes of clarity, this presentation is divided as follows. 1. What is subversion? A few definitions and what to expect. 2. Types of subversion, attrition or clogging or neutering, takeover, destruction and specific. 3. Subverting NGOs or other community organizations, and yes, this is community organizing for the right. 4. Subverting smaller political parties, this is only for Europe and maybe perhaps Canada as well, since there is no such thing as relevant small political parties in the United States. 5. Subverting small and medium enterprises. 6. Subversion within larger corporations. 7. Subversion within cultural institutions. And finally, 8. Other ideas and conclusions. This will be quite a long course, and considering the feedback I got from the previous courses on practical politics, you'll probably need to take notes. Also, as usual with these things, it might be a good idea to download this video as well to use for future reference in case Google decides that this video is dangerous, and I wouldn't blame them too much if they did, because it is dangerous. Most of Google employees are subverted people who made agitating for change for the sake of change an entire lifestyle and a way of life, so the biggest threat to the status quo is for normal people to learn some of this as well. So, point number 1. What is subversion? Now, there are many academic definitions for subversion, and entire bookshelves have been written about the topic, although most of them not in English, but the shortest definition that I can give is as follows. Subversion is the using of an existent state of affairs to forward goals that are different or even contrary to the ones pursued by that said state of affairs and status quo. It also needs to be said that subversion in itself is morally neutral. It is just a tool. It is not inherently evil, nor inherently good. This is best explained by examples. When the abolitionists first started to agitate for, well, the abolition of slavery, they engaged in subversion. In the countries of Europe, they used the pre-existent Christian framework, specifically the part in which everyone purported to believe, namely that all individuals are equal in the eyes of God. And if that is true, and the monarchs are ruling by the grace of God, so the argument went, then it should indeed follow that all individuals ought to be equal in the eyes of the monarchical power, which everyone already believed it existed through the grace of God. In the United States, a similar path was followed. The abolitionists latched on to the phrasing, all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And thus, the argument followed, slaves are also endowed with the same unalienable rights, and thus slavery is unjustifiable. Of course, in the case of the United States, things were a bit more complicated because there was an entire body of intellectual workarounds heavily working to argue that indeed all men are created equal, but then some men are less than men. I won't get into that now because it's not within the purposes of this talk. But the point is that abolitionists did essentially engage in subversion. Another example. When the left became a thing in Sweden, they soon realized that they had the exact same problem as leftists had anywhere else in Europe. Namely that, contrary to orthodox Marxist theory, the working class would gladly join hands with the bourgeoisie and fight for their country, their king, their culture, their language, and their faith, and most definitely would not join hands with, let's say, the working class in Finland or Russia to overthrow the monarchy and establish an international socialist utopia. This was a problem for the left throughout the early 20th century and even later on, even in the countries where they had imposed themselves via tanks, such as the countries of the Intermarium. We know this because even after 50 years of mandatory socialism, bourgeois values and national solidarity as opposed to transnational class solidarity came back almost overnight once the Soviet boot was out. The Swedish left, though, came up with another idea, inspired in part by the wider left of Trotsky, Georg Lukács, Adorno, Gramsci, and so on and so forth, namely to infiltrate and subvert the already existent status quo. So instead of fighting to abolish the monarchy, the Church of Sweden, the capitalist state, and the bourgeoisie, the Swedish left slowly started working to become all of these things. This approach was much slower and yielded the first results much later than expected, but it worked. If you had told a young Swedish man in the 1920s that Svenska kyrka will be talking about gender-neutral Jesus, that the king will be an open borders militant, and that the state will be the main driver of family separation under the guise of protecting the children, he would not have believed you. In fact, if you had said that out loud too many times in 1920s Sweden, you could have ended up in a loony bin. Yet, that's exactly what happened. Basically, over time, leftists started joining the organizations they despised and worked tirelessly for decades to subvert them from within. It took them over 50 years, but it worked. The main advantage of subversion is that you don't need the majority of the people to agree with you. 15% of the populace is more than enough. 20% stubborn radicals and the success is almost guaranteed. And this works regardless of the cause supported. But more on that in a future video. For the time being, it is necessary to remember that you don't need 50% plus 1 to effect change, because change rarely comes as a result of a broad majority consensus. It is the radicals that win over the long run, and not the moderates. Another example, tolerance for marijuana. The dispute over marijuana, contrary to what is being told on TV and in newspapers, is not a legal one, but a cultural one. So even though in Europe there is only Portugal that has legalized marijuana, in practice this particular drug is widely tolerated in the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Albania, Italy, and several other countries of Europe. This is possible because the culture has been subverted enough to simply ignore the law. As I always tell people, the law is useful only as long as the vast majority of the people comply with it voluntarily, and also the individuals to whom the law doesn't apply are not just comfortable with it, but enthusiastically in support of it. Translation: a law to ban marijuana needs not just the passive support of the population, but also a 10 to 20% militant support for it. If that stubborn minority doesn't exist, then the law is worth less than the paper it is written on. And in many places, that militant minority has been obliterated. The most spectacular example is the Netherlands, a country about which everyone believes it has legal marijuana. It doesn't. Weed is not legal in the Netherlands. It's just that nobody really cares enough to even talk about cracking down on it, let alone actually doing something about it. And this was possible because of a subversion of the culture. Alright, I think this is enough to define things. Now let's go to the meat of the matter. Point number 2, types of subversion. And there are 4 broad types of subversion, although this categorization can be widened even further, and there are examples in history when the categories have been successfully combined, but that's a very long story, we won't get into that now. So the 4 broad types of subversion are as follows: subversion of attrition, subversion for takeover, subversion for destruction or discrediting, and specific subversion. This categorization is useful because the agent of subversion needs to be clear in his or her mind about what the goal is. Subversion only works if the goal is very clear. The agents of subversion are patient enough and stubborn enough, or relentless. So, a few words about each category. The names are pretty self-explanatory though. So subversion of attrition is the subversive activity meant to clog or neutralize the activity of the institution or group that is the target of subversion. The most common example of subversion of attrition is in the modern era are the leftists who join right-wing political parties. Americans even have a name for them: Republicans in name only. The purpose of those individuals, for the most part, is not to make the organization more like them, but to make the organization less effective. And this type of subversion is chosen when the subverters know and understand beforehand that changing the organization is either not possible at all, or it is so complicated that it is not worth the effort. This type of subversion is also chosen when the agents of subversion understand that destruction is not possible. For instance, the Republican Party will always have a 15% stubborn minority support. So attempting as a leftist to destroy it outright is not only difficult and next to impossible, but indeed counterproductive, because it comes with an almost guaranteed backlash so severe that it risks drawing in another 30 to 40% of passive support. Less spectacular, but nevertheless useful, examples of subversion of attrition are the various operations that I was either part of or orchestrated within local communities. For instance, when I send some of my people inside very radical organizations, usually communist or feminist, I know beforehand that there is no serious way to convince those people that they're wrong. Not within a time frame of 6 to 12 months, which is the maximum amount of time that a small-scale subversion operation lasts. So the purpose is almost always to drag that organization down and render their efforts useless. A more spectacular type of subversion of attrition, which I am in the process of preparing right now, is to create controlled opposition. For instance, if the agent of subversion lives in a town of, let's say, 20,000 inhabitants and knows full well that around, let's say, 400 people in the town are militant communists that are not yet part of any organization, the best course of action is to create it yourself and try to attract as many of those 400 people as possible. Such course of action, orchestrated carefully, can neuter the communist activity for years and sometimes decades if the organization is able to project the message that anything other than that organization is not true communist and thus unacceptable in polite society. This has been tried on a larger scale as well. CDU in Germany, for instance, exists solely for the purpose of not allowing any genuine right wing to emerge. Now lately, this arrangement is starting to crumble, but it worked for at least 2 decades since the CDU became effectively a left-wing party. Alright, number 2, subversion for takeover. This is pretty much self-explanatory. This type of subversion is also the most common, and its purpose is to fundamentally transform the subverted organization. There isn't one way of doing this, mind you. Sometimes a takeover operation can last for decades, sometimes it can take as little as 3 months. It depends on a lot of factors, including, of course, the size and scope of the organization, but also the demographics of that organization. And by demographics, I mean the percentage of radicals inside that organization. One-man organizations are the easiest to subvert, which is why I personally never make my organizations official and why I actively promote a decentralized model of organizing, precisely so the organizations can be harder and oftentimes next to impossible to subvert. A spectacular example of subversion for takeover is the Southern Poverty Law Center, or the SPLC. I explained this 2 years ago in the video How to Agitate Inside the SPLC. Basically, in the 1980s, when the initial mission of the SPLC had already been entirely accomplished, a bunch of radicals came in and took over the whole operation and in time turned it into the insane mess that the SPLC is today. Alright, we'll get back to this later in the video. Number 3, subversion for destruction or discrediting. Now this type of subversion is not that common, although you wouldn't know that because many subversion for takeover operations can appear to be of the discrediting type. Subversion for discrediting is done for the purposes of demoralization of the pre-existent base. This was done extensively by governments, chief among them being the now quite known COINTELPRO operations. Oftentimes, this type of subversion does come in conjunction with one of the other 3 types. The most common scenario is to engage in this type of subversion if and after your previous attempts have been uncovered or unmasked, to keep in line with the KGB terminology. For instance, suppose you want to take over your local secularist group, which is usually a left-wing social justice type of group, and you want to turn it into something more like Secularists for Life, and perhaps give it a more anti-Islam bent. And suppose in the middle of you gathering enough radicals into the group to force a vote to oust the current leadership, your efforts get exposed, for whatever reason. And there are many reasons for which this might happen, not all of them under the control or responsibility of the initial agitator and subverter. One way to salvage at least something out of the subversion operation is to then double down on the exposure to the original base. What that means in practice is to engage in gaslighting and demoralize the base by telling them and making them feel like the group is now useless since it has been already infiltrated by bigots or the far right or whatever buzzwords the base uses to refer to normal people. Such a tactic has 3 potential results. First is the base becomes distraught and demoralized, in which case you succeeded in subversion of discrediting, which is less than your initial goal but better than nothing. Second potential result is the base becomes angry and leaves the organization, in which case you can get back to your initial takeover goal now that some of the radicals voluntarily rage quitted. And finally, the third potential result is the base becomes angry and mobilizes to oust you or your people from the organization, in which case the whole operation is mostly a failure, though you can use the failure to still discredit the organization in the eyes of the wider public by showing they're vulnerable to infiltration and thus unreliable and inconsistent. Now, mind you, subversion is a hard game. You will experience failure in some of your attempts. This is why we need happy people and why this should be done only by people who have previously, well, sorted themselves out, as Jordan Peterson would put it. Anyway, finally, number 4, specific subversion. This type of subversion is pretty common and oftentimes never identified as a type of subversion per se because it is the easiest form, and oftentimes people engage in this without even realizing at a conscious level that what they're doing is subversion. There are many visible examples of this, chief among them are the YouTubers of the liberal left who work tirelessly to convince their fellow leftists about 1 or 2 specific topics and otherwise upholding the rest of the cake. This type of subversion is oftentimes deployed on friends rather than foes, or in the case of institutions, it's deployed on institutions whom you don't want to see destroyed, or even institutions you would be bothered to see destroyed. The Tea Party is another example of specific subversion, the aim having been not to fundamentally transform the Republican Party or destroy it, but merely to fill its top ranks with individuals that were even more fiscally conservative than the ones that were already in the leadership of the GOP. Anyway, there are many examples, but I guess I should stop here with the theory and get to the practice of subversion, a topic about which there are even fewer resources, especially for non-leftists, because normal people have rarely attempted to engage in subversion. And even when they did not recognize the procedure for what it was. So without further ado, let's move to point number 3, subverting NGOs or other community organizations. Now, for this point, and for the next 4 points indeed, one needs to keep in mind that it is up to the agitator or subverter or political operative, call him what you want. It is up for the initiator of the subversion operation to decide what kind of subversion is appropriate. Decide the wrong way and the subversion operation is likely to fail. Decide the correct way and the underlings don't abide, same result. So before even going into specifics of subverting NGOs, let me give you some tips and tricks on how to decide what kind of subversion is appropriate. Mind you, there isn't a correct or by-the-book way of deciding this. It's largely based on instinct and available intelligence about the target. So, first of all, you need to know as many things as possible about the target. Some of that information, especially in the case of NGOs and political parties, is available for free, but much of it isn't. So you need to know at the very least the following. How many paying members does the organization have? How many sympathizers does the organization have? Also, how many of those sympathizers are public about it? How much money does the organization have and where did it get it from? How much money can the organization access on a relatively short notice, let's say in 3 months? What is the decision-making process in that organization? Is it via a general assembly? Is it via a board of directors who vote? Is it via qualified or simple majority? Or via unanimity? Most organizations have a mixture of these and you need to know exactly what mixture. Also, how many people are in the board of directors or whatever the equivalent body? And also, who are those people? And here you need as much intel as possible. Anything is relevant, really, including whether they like cats or not. And no, I'm not joking. Does the organization have any connection with the state or any governmental agency? And if so, what kind of connection? And what agency? All of this information needs to be acquired before even considering a subversion operation, let alone decide what kind of subversion to deploy. Once you have as much information as humanly possible, then you can start analyzing. So for NGOs, there are a few scenarios that almost always come up. So NGOs are usually of 3 types: international, national, and local. Then each of these 3 types have 2 flavors: state-connected and non-state connected. To understand why and how is this the case, please watch or re-watch my older video, The False Civil Society. Basically, even though the name says NGO, i.e. non-governmental organization, in practice this rarely means what it says. A significant chunk of NGOs, especially the national and international types, are indeed various forms of de facto governmental branches, either by intent or by practice. For instance, let's take ILGA, or the International Gay and Lesbian Association. For all intents and purposes, ILGA is a branch of the supranational governmental institutions, specifically the European Union and the United Nations. This means that subversion for the purpose of takeover is very difficult, even if you wield a tremendous amount of resources. But that doesn't mean it cannot be subverted. All of these organizations, whether they're government connected, like ILGA is, or not really that connected with the government, like the Open Society Foundations, can only operate on a federative level. This means that it is rarely the case that the central body of the organization, i.e. the founder or the board of directors, really knows what happens in every chapter. Some of that was explained in the podcast with Jacob Grandstaff of the Capital Research Center, where he explained, correctly, that in the case of the Open Society Foundations, it is hardly efficient to attack George Soros personally because he rarely, if ever, knows what's happening in a particular chapter of the OSF. This makes perfect sense. Soros is just one individual. It is humanly impossible to know every single detail or even the broad terms of every chapter of a huge empire. The same is true in big corporations, mind you. It's not like the CEO of Volkswagen has any idea about, let's say, the human resources policies at the Volkswagen plant in Brazil. That's not how things work. In practice, though, most of us don't deal with such bodies, but rather with an affiliate of such bodies or with a completely independent organization. In both of these cases, the tactics are the same, but the goals will have to differ a little bit. For instance, if you're aiming for an NGO that is directly part of the Open Society foundations, it is not reasonable to aim for subversion for takeover. You're not going to succeed. Or let me put it another way. In order to succeed, it would cost so much that the rewards are simply not worth it. What you can do, however, is to aim at discrediting. Most of these smaller chapters of the OSF do exist solely because of grants from the OSF. So if you can get them discredited in the eyes of the OSF, then you have effectively destroyed them. That is far more efficient. But even that is rare, though I'm glad to offer further information in private should any of you wishes to try his luck on such an affiliate of a big federative body. What is a lot more common is the situation of relatively independent NGOs who end up wielding a decent amount of influence over local politics. In the case of medium-sized countries, such NGOs can even be national rather than regional or local. Some prominent examples would be Stowarzyszenie Interwencji Prawnej, or the Association for Legal Intervention, a Polish NGO busy with legal activism against white people and Christians. Sorry, I mean an NGO with a, quote, mission to ensure social cohesion by promoting equality of all people under the law with the target groups migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, prisoners, and foster families, close quote. Needless to say, such scum was very unhappy when the normal people in Poland decided to do counter-agitation, which ended with SIP seeing its funding cut to a third of what used to be before 2015. Another example could be most of the pro-homosexual organizations in Europe, except those in the Netherlands, Belgium and Hungary, which are all affiliated to either OSF or ILGA. But besides those exceptions, these NGOs are largely independent from an organizational standpoint. Now, of course, we all know that they are not ideologically independent that much, but that can be changed. It is important, though, that they be organizationally independent, because otherwise there's not much you can do in terms of subversion if you are a single individual or a small group of individuals. So what can you do? Well, after you gathered the information and conducted a preliminary analysis, look up for a way to get inside the organization that you have targeted. Most NGOs do have outreach activities in some way, shape or form, especially the ones this audience might want to target. To gain experience, first try to target a minuscule organization, such as the local chapter of the Parents-Teacher Association or something like that, and do try to subvert it. For instance, if you have friends with kids of similar age or same age as yours, go into the same school and form a radical corner of parents who oppose, let's say, genderist sex education. It is very doable. And again, you don't need a majority. If the curricula is decided by a panel of, let's say, 10 parents, if you get 2 of your people in that panel and stick to your guns, you will win most of the time. Anyway, this subtopic could be a video in and of itself, but we need to go further, so this video won't go beyond 90 minutes. So, point number 4, subverting smaller political parties. Now, I have touched on this in previous practical politics videos, and this collection of people around this channel is already engaged in 3 separate operations in 3 European countries to attempt this. From the experience gathered so far, it is slightly easier than expected, but nevertheless complex. Unlike NGOs and corporations, political parties, even tiny ones, are remarkably complex animals. Even political parties aimed at being simplistic very soon end up being very complex in their internal machinations. Also, unlike NGOs and corporations, disguising your subversion attempts is significantly harder for obvious reasons. NGOs and corporations are full of people whose purpose there is not politics per se, while in political parties, well, almost everyone there is for the politics, even if politics is not necessarily their main reason. Also, not all parties are equal. Some are more heterogeneous, and it is thus easier to infiltrate into and mask your subversion attempts under the guise of just regular concerns. However, most political parties, including and especially smaller ones, tend to rapidly develop an internal orthodoxy and, well, a party line. The most efficient moment to target such political parties is within their first 3 years of existence. If they've been around for more than one full complete election cycle, that would be 4 years, then it's already quite hard to accomplish anything via subversion unless you have vast resources at your disposal. In any event, with political parties, the same rules as for NGOs apply when it comes to deciding what type of subversion you wish to deploy. And one nice thing is that takeover is, at least in theory, easier in political parties than in NGOs. And this is because, in theory, all political parties in Europe, with the exception of Belarus, I guess, have to at least attempt to be democratic. This means in practice that there is always a mechanism through which your people can get in power inside that political party, if takeover is your intention. In my experience, though, the most efficient subversion in such organizations is not takeover, but discrediting and attrition. But this is likely because I have only targeted organizations that I have viewed as my enemy all the time and considered that nothing that they would do could possibly be a good thing. In terms of easiness, discrediting is by far the easiest. I have given in the past the example of joining the local chapter of the Swedish Green Party, make sure the looniest greenie is on the ballot, and then in parallel run a black propaganda campaign so that everyone in a district knows about the loon. Another example that I know from experience, and I'd better be careful what I say now, is a chap who joined the CDU in Germany and agitated for the most far-left open borders loon to be on CDU's ballot in that district. Then, in the meantime, his friends ran interference and black propaganda outside the party to let the people of that district know that the CDU is up to no good, and the history of that candidate became common knowledge. And after 4 months of work, the loon did end up on the ballot, and in the election, CDU finished second in that district. I won't give exact percentages because I don't want to out the chap, but suffice to say that nobody saw that coming. Well, nobody except those of us who knew. For longer-term subversion, though, only smaller parties are worth targeting, especially those founded recently. It is not particularly rewarding to try to subvert big political forces unless you have a lot of money with which to buy the services of several full-time subverters and agitators, something which I will take the liberty to assume it is beyond the capacity of the people watching this, so I won't get into that. Alright. Number 5. Subverting SMEs, or small and medium enterprises. In Europe and North America, SMEs represent anywhere between 90 and 97% of the economy, depending on the country or jurisdiction. So targeting SMEs is almost always worth the hassle. Unlike NGOs and political parties, subversion with the purpose of takeover is entirely impossible in SMEs, even with very small companies. If you want to take over a company, there are much more straightforward ways, and many countries even have specific legislation on how hostile or not so hostile takeovers can be engineered. You need shekels for that, of course, but it's doable. So it's no point in trying to do it via subversion, because even if you do succeed by some miracle, you still need shekels, so it's a waste of time. Also, unlike NGOs and political parties, subversion of attrition is impossible due to the nature of the organization. An SME exists first and foremost with the purpose of turning a profit. If someone is clogging the organization, someone else easily notices because it's a small enterprise, and you'll soon find yourself without a job. So the only types of subversion that do work are the subversion for destruction and specific subversion. And both are, in and of themselves, area specific. So for instance, if you're in a highly conservative area, convincing the company to put out leftist messaging is a good way to conduct some discrediting without even attracting much flack from the company, well, until it's too late, but then that won't matter anymore. If you're in a highly leftist area, then convincing the company to put out messaging that can be interpreted as being non-leftist is an efficient way of conducting some discrediting. But again, it really does depend on the area and the type of activity. If it's an online company, then all bets are off because most of the classical tools simply won't work. What is a lot more interesting in Subversion of SMEs is to try to get yourself in the position to dictate the culture of the organization. And this is not that difficult per se, although it does take a lot of time. Basically, unlike big corporations, one can become an indispensable asset. And in small firms, the employee that is indispensable ends up wielding a tremendous amount of informal power, whether that employee wants it or not. This happens all the time in small firms. There's always that one guy who's been with the company for 5 years or more and has done so many spectacular things that he can basically do whatever he wants when compared to his peers. Now, of course, that doesn't mean he can literally do whatever he wants, but it does mean that such individuals do get a lot more leeway and can do a lot of things that his peers could never get away with. These individuals are also the main drivers of the backlash against the Me Too nonsense, because these individuals are whispering in the ears of the CEO or the founder, and the founder listens to them because they've been right multiple times in the past. In fact, the backlash against Me Too is a large-scale demonstration of specific subversion, through which policies are being changed in real time without anyone being formally noticed. And the more of this, the more this is happening, the more our political opponents go nuts. Because SMEs are the bloodline of any capitalist economy. Sheryl Sandberg can blather on about mentor her as much as she wants. The trends in the economy are not dictated by the IT giants that much, but by companies with fewer than 50 employees, which represent more than 90% of the economy most of the time. And once SMEs no longer swallow the diversity is strength mantra, all bets are off, which is why subversion within SMEs is crucial. Now, mind you, this can be applied to many causes, not just countering misandric trends. For instance, the refusal of Greek bars to observe the smoking ban led to a fundamental change in the way the law looks at these things. I suspect something similar is on the pipeline in the Netherlands as well. And there are many other examples where SMEs can subvert the entire culture. So attempting to subvert an SME yourself is self-evidently useful. And never underestimate the power. 10 people working in 10 different SMEs in the same area, let's say a county or a city, and doing subversion work can radically change the culture of that area. As I said, change in the culture and even in politics rarely requires a majority. And in economics, this is absolutely true, since it is rarely the case of an actor having the majority of the market, and yet they still change the whole thing. So always keep in mind whenever you're asking, what difference does it make? Because it does. Alright, now let's move to point number 6, subversion within larger corporations. Now, in this kind of environment, there are some common elements with SMEs, namely that specific subversion works almost the same and subversion for takeover is just as impossible. Additionally, subversion for destruction is also mostly impossible in larger corporations as opposed to SMEs. That is because of the sheer size of such organizations. Now, this doesn't mean it cannot be done at all. It just means that it cannot be done by 1 or 2 people wielding limited resources, which are the target audience of this video. However, large corporations routinely have the same weaknesses as government bureaucracies and the state in general. And that is because larger corporations do share a lot of traits with the state. The reason they are preferable to the state is because they don't have the power to arrest and because they do eventually go out of business, albeit slowly, whereas the state refuses to die even if it should have long gone out of business. One such trait that can be exploited for subversion is the fact that they are federative and slow. Federative in the sense that it is rarely the case that the branches know about each other, and even rarer for the top brass to know the details of what's going on in every branch. That's why when a scandal hits the press, you have astonished CEOs who really don't know what to say to the press. And that's not because the CEOs are necessarily incompetent, though surely some of them are, but because the larger a corporation is, or really any organization, because this applies to the Open Society Foundation Trust as well, the larger an organization is, the less likely it is for the top brass to be aware of the machinations of all of its branches. This also makes them slow. One competitive advantage of SMEs against big corporations is the fact that SMEs can adapt to change relatively quickly, whereas big corporations oftentimes need years to make even the most petty changes. This fact can be pretty frustrating for someone willing to engage in specific subversion within a large corporation, but it is also very useful if you're willing to engage in subversion of attrition. Because unlike big federative NGOs, big corporations are susceptible to subversion of attrition. How do I know this? Well, because I've seen it deployed successfully several times. The most recent success that I'm aware of is 4 people working in 4 different branches of the same corporation, keeping the affirmative action hiring process from being implemented for several years, and then engineering a consensus that implementing the policy is difficult and expensive, thus persuading the top brass to quietly abandon the idea altogether. No press release, no public explanation, no nothing. The whole thing was just swept under the carpet like it never happened, and everyone moved on. How was that possible? Well, it took several years of unspectacular subversion work. Basically, what these people did was to befriend those who were in charge of implementing the policies, namely the HR and the regional director, and then agitate to them and to their friends about how messed up affirmative action is. And what I mean by this is persuading the daughter of the boss that the policy is bad, befriending his wife and persuading her, dating his cousin and persuading him, basically all in to make the immediate circles of both the local boss and the HR sing to the tune that affirmative action is cancer. This took about 2 years. Then the discussion was moved into the workplace, with everyone convinced that the feedback was coming from outside the firm, since nobody ever suspected this was deliberate. Heck, nobody outside the firm even knew that affirmative action was on the pipeline. The opinion of the outside world was never even asked, let alone assessed. And once this happened, slowly everyone started stalling on implementation, and another year went by. Then, when the top brass started asking questions, out of the blue, the agitators offered to consult with other branches. And purely by coincidence, as you can imagine, they chose the branches that were also subjected to subversion, and voila! There's your consensus. Then emails got sent to the top brass, and that was that. No affirmative action to that corporation. To my knowledge, the policy is still in place today. No affirmative action whatsoever, 4 years after the subversion operation was concluded. These things work. Now, of course, this is a more complex example, but most of the time subversion doesn't take such complex forms, because it is rarely the case that the top brass comes down in a big firm to impose things overnight. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it is very uncommon. I should also mention that when I say large firms, I don't mean just in terms of revenue or turnover, but in terms of employees as well. Facebook, for instance, is a wealthy firm, but it is not a particularly large firm. With just a bit over 25,000 employees, including the low-level monkeys who delete comments, Facebook is not a large firm in the context of this talk. Volkswagen, on the other hand, with almost 700,000 employees, more than entire countries, is a large firm. Walmart is a large firm. Deutsche Telekom is a large firm. Basically, a company is a large firm if it has at least 50,000 people involved in it. Again, large and wealthy are not directly correlated, at least not all the time. Indian Railways, for instance, has 1.4 million employees, yet its revenue is a meager $29 billion. That's still lower than Ernst & Young, which has 250,000 employees and a revenue of $31.4 billion. Another aspect, before we move on, there is nobody that can provide authoritative guidance on how to deploy subversion in big tech companies. James Damore and his many friends are basically writing the book as we speak. So if you work in any of these big tech firms, I will be able to provide some guidance, but in a rather limited capacity, because unlike traditional firms, there isn't a body of past knowledge to be applied. Understand, subversion in other types of firms has been a thing since at least the 1920s, so there's almost 100 years of knowledge on the topic. Not so with tech firms, for which there is less than a decade of body of knowledge, and some of it is still confidential enough that not even trained agitators can access yet. But we're coming after you. No, seriously, Google, you're next. Alright, finally, point number 7, subversion within cultural institutions. Now, here I have the least amount of experience or direct contact, and this should come as no surprise since I am quite far from being an artsy type, and also the right in general has been severely understaffed in this department. Nevertheless, subverting in such institutions is incredibly expensive and taxing, and it does require a lot of time and the kind of bold moves not required in other places. For instance, if the purpose is takeover, you really need to physically remove not just the majority, but usually almost all individuals in the leadership of that institution in order to be successful. An obvious example would be universities, where the left began to dominate only after it had 2/3 or more of the leadership. The reverse is also true. University of Chicago still stands as an island of mental sanity precisely because it excludes the far left from leadership and takes active steps to prevent even the possibility of subversion. The point here is that subverting a cultural institution that is relevant outside of a small town is indeed beyond the realm of small-time activists with scarce resources. I guess those small cultural centers that sometimes do still exist in towns with 50,000 inhabitants or less, those can be targeted for subversion, but I'm not convinced that it would be a wise use of limited resources, given that those centers are rarely relevant in shaping the society and the politics of the area they serve. So unless you're really that good, like say a Jordan Peterson, then attempting to engage in this will lead to disappointment most of the time. There is one exception to this rule: students. Although the risks are high, it does make sense if you are a student to try to co-opt pre-existent groups in your campus or to clog them. But this is only truly effective in conjunction with a wider agitation effort, like black propaganda and/or active measures. And by active measures, I mean it in the KGB sense, активные мероприятия. And more of that, I guess, later on, and by later on I mean in June, when I get back from the United States, where I will have interviewed the chap who did engage in all of these three, subversion, black propaganda, and active measures, inside the campus, and won. So I promise I'll get back to this topic with primary sources, essentially exclusive to this channel. But until then, I'll leave this particular point in a bit of a limbo, especially considering that the class is getting a bit long. Alright, so finally point number 8, other ideas and conclusions. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind, no matter the context in which you wish to deploy subversion or the type of subversion you choose. First of all, you will fail at first. This is an activity that requires patience and relentlessness. Our political opponents worked tirelessly for 80 to 120 years, depending on the country, to achieve the results they're enjoying now. We can undo most of them in less than 30 years, but we cannot, and you cannot, achieve spectacular results in 3 months, or even in 3 years. Second of all, the less known you are, the more likely you are to be successful. The reason I stopped doing subversion is because I became known enough. Now I train and guide less known people to do the same thing. Basically, there are limits. At some point, you become visible enough to no longer be effective in your subversion efforts. The most efficient subverters are people who can be invisible, people who can blend in so well that not even those who actively look for subverters can notice them. That's why I routinely recruit from places where one would expect it the least. When polite society thinks of conservative subversion, they imagine some Bible thumper or some weirdo who always talks about God or morality. They never expect a hedonistic atheist, for instance, or a very young guy who on paper has all the bona fides of a progressive. This is why James Damore was such a shock, because nobody expected it from him. And there will be more shocks like these. You wouldn't even believe me if I told you that some of the most efficient moles inside leftist institutions who send information to people like me are individuals with a Muslim-sounding name or Negroid women with Tumblr blogs. Heck, I didn't believe it either at first when the emails and leaks started coming in. The point is that your chances of successful subversion increase if you're Mr. or Mrs. Nobody. And I'm not joking. If you're a completely unremarkable individual, then you're the least likely person to be suspected of being a subverter. That's why the left is afraid these days and tries to regulate speech on the internet, because the smarter ones of the left know very well, just like I know, that any random John Doe could be an infiltrator that helps the opposition. And with the internet, coordination is also easier than ever before. Thirdly, discretion is paramount. The fewer people know about your agenda, the better. Leave no trace of communication. Use encryption or self-destructing mediums like IRC. Do not use the phone to discuss such matters, and make sure that anything that could reasonably be leaked is also easy to frame it as lunacy. One of the problems, but also the great advantages of subversion, is the fact that most people don't believe subversion exists. So in 999 out of 1,000 cases of attempts to expose you, you will be facing someone who not only doesn't believe, but is absolutely convinced that subversion doesn't exist. So unless you're facing another ideologue, be prepared to reframe the whole situation as lunacy. That almost always keeps your cover intact and sometimes even backfires on the person that leaked the information. One of my former colleagues at one of my previous workplaces was fired because he kept on trying to warn the leadership that I was there to subvert. He was right. The problem is that I was able to explain away all of my activities as being very innocuous, and his narrative as the result of delusions of a madman who watched too many conspiracy videos on the internet. He still hates me to this day for that. And that's point number 4. Always be prepared to dump people. Or put it another way, do not engage in subversion against friends. Because sometimes this activity will mean that you have to be unscrupulous. You need a kind of mentality that is very cold-hearted sometimes. It's the only way you can mitigate the collateral damage. Like my former colleague. I didn't want to get the guy fired. I tried to plead with him to stop talking, but he didn't listen. And in the end, I didn't care. It wasn't my fault that he wouldn't be persuaded by reason, and if I had intervened to avoid him being fired, it would have meant an implicit admission that he had a point. And we couldn't have that. Cold-hearted, as I said, something with which conservatives aren't particularly acquainted, at least on a rhetorical level, but you will learn, just like I learned. Ultimately, subversion is not an activity that you do for fame. Most of the subversion work goes completely unnoticed, but its effects can last centuries and oftentimes at least decades. If you aim to be famous, then subversion is not for you. If you aim to be perceived as someone who minds his own business and nods along to get along, then you're the perfect candidate for subversion work. People who can appear to be mediocre are the best subverters. Because in most cases, You don't have to become the boss. In fact, it's oftentimes a bad idea to become the boss. The most efficient subversion is done by convincing the boss that it was his idea all along to change things in the direction the subverter wants to. That not only effects more lasting change, but also leaves the subverter clean in case of a backlash. Remember this part because it is what the left is teaching in its academies, such as Common Purpose. You will notice that virtually all leftist schools of subversion and agitation aim exclusively at training clerks, HR officers, diversity officers, and things of that nature. They never aim at training CEOs or future prime ministers. That's because they understand that a country, a society, and indeed a company, in the case of larger firms, these things are not ruled by the CEO or the prime minister or the president or what have you, but by the mediocre underlings tasked to enforce and maintain the structure. In the case of the government, we call that the deep state, which has now become a rather dirty term, but we explained it in detail on this channel before it became a term used by the cathedral media. In the case of our corporations, you will notice that the boss's secretary or the HR office wields far more power and influence than the actual boss. Of course, exceptions do exist, but as a rule, if you own the bureaucracy, you effectively own the company. There are ways to prevent this from happening, but most companies don't want to hear because most companies, just like most people, are firmly convinced either that ideological subversion doesn't exist or that it cannot happen to them. But that's a topic for another video on how to prevent subversion. I may explain at some point in time, though not anytime soon, since I would rather keep that information for my counseling clients. Alright, I guess that's it for now. I guess I can say class dismissed. So, what's your take on this? Because again, I do not claim to have the absolute truth on this. Just several years of study and practice, and I still do continue to gather knowledge to this day. For instance, 3 years ago when I started this channel, I had no idea about subversion of political parties. That's knowledge that I acquired since 2016. So it's a perpetual learning process when it comes to subversion. So what is your experience? Have you tried to engage in any form of subversion? And if yes, how did that work out? If not, are you curious? How would you go about it? This is of course an ongoing conversation because there is no definitive way of doing subversion, but it's a conversation that is badly needed because we don't yet even have a broad script or even some broad guidelines, whereas our political opponents have 80 years of knowledge of trial and error. And while I have no doubt that we can close that gap in less than half of the time they needed, this will require work, field work by foot soldiers, and thankless anonymous work. Most of it so anonymous that you won't be able to talk about with anyone except a few close friends, and sometimes not even that. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your consistent and generous support. If you derive any value from the work being done here, please do consider giving a shekel, please do subscribe to my social media, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.